Today, we're delving into a book titled The Taste of Civilization, A History of Food. In it, the author explores a central question. Throughout the long history of human food, which events truly count as revolutionary milestones? Walk into any bookshop, and you'll find that food and cookery books hold a prominent place, with everything from endless recipe collections and gourmet travelogues to captivating food histories. The history of food is particularly fascinating. You'll find books like Diet in the Middle Ages, which recounts how people struggled to survive in times of scarcity. Others focus on a single ingredient with titles like Tomato, Potato, or Cod. Then there are those that explore taste itself, such as Sweetness and Power, which examines the historical role of sugarcane, or A History of Salt that delves into soy sauce and pickles. In truth, no matter the angle, all food histories share a common theme: the story of how humanity first managed to get enough to eat, and then sought to eat well. You could say that the history of food is the history of humanity itself. The book we're discussing today, The Taste of Civilization, takes a particularly unique perspective. It isn't confined to a single ingredient or flavor. Instead, it adopts a grand, sweeping view to examine the entire evolutionary journey of food. The author charts a complete map of our culinary development, from the moment humans learned to use fire right up to the modern food industry. Tackling such a vast topic is no small feat. This brings us to the author, Felipe Fernandez Armesto, a renowned British historian. He taught at the University of Oxford for many years, is a columnist for the New York Times, and a presenter for well-known BBC programs. His most celebrated field of research is actually maritime and colonial history. Influenced by his Spanish father, who was a journalist, much of his historical work is connected to the Age of Discovery and Spain. Perhaps the inspiration for writing The Taste of Civilization was partly sparked by Spanish cuisine. After all, when it comes to the art of eating, the Spanish are considerably more discerning than the British. The Spanish government later awarded Fernandez Armesto a national medal in recognition of his contributions to Spain in the fields of geography and culinary writing. So, let's step into the world of food as seen through the eyes of this historian. The book is vast, so we will focus on three core aspects that are most central and relevant to us. First, the invention of cooking. Second, the sources of our food. And third, the formation of taste. Along the way, I'll mention a few familiar dishes that might just become interesting topics of conversation the next time you're sharing a meal with friends. First, let's look at the invention of cooking. Have you ever eaten an oyster? Its very nature suggests the classic way to eat it, raw. While we might occasionally grill or steam them, they are most often eaten uncooked. You prise open the shell and slurp the soft creature down, along with its brine. One oyster expert poetically described the experience. To eat an oyster is to taste the sea, to accept the essence of seaweed and the sea breeze, to swallow that mouthful of seawater, fragrant with the ocean. The oyster is arguably the closest thing to a truly wild food in the Western diet. You might argue that the apples and hawthorns we eat are natural too, but in reality, most of our daily fruits and vegetables are the product of thousands of years of human cultivation and breeding, and that includes berries picked in the wild. Natural oysters, however, are unaltered, and their flavor varies dramatically depending on the waters they come from. More importantly, we consume them while they're still alive, a practice that has become rare in modern cuisine. Besides oysters, some restaurants also serve raw minced beef, known in Western cuisine as steak tartare. The Tartars were a branch of a Mongolian tribe, once seen by Westerners as a symbol of savagery. Linking raw beef with barbarians seems to suggest that eating uncooked food is a primitive act. Yet, the preparation of steak tartare is incredibly refined. A chef might even prepare it at your table, mixing the fresh mince with herbs, spring onions, capers, pepper, olives, and a raw egg, before finishing it with a splash of vodka. You'll notice that the rawer the dish, the more exquisite its preparation tends to be. Think of Japanese sashimi. The chef's masterful knife skills and the artful presentation create a process filled with ritual. The way early humans ate raw meat, however, was far from today's refined practices. In 1540, a Spanish knight on the American continent recorded how Native Americans would share a bison. After killing it, the hunters would first cut open its belly, squeeze out the semi-digested grass from the stomach, and drink the juice, declaring it the essence of the stomach. Then they would put the raw meat in their mouths, chew it a couple of times and swallow. Finally, they would clean out the intestines to use as containers, fill them with bison blood, and drink it on their journey when thirsty. Now that was true steak tartare. In reality, raw meat is neither easy to digest nor to swallow. Humans learned to cook to make food more palatable. The very first culinary technique was the mastery of fire. You could say that the use of fire is a monumental milestone in the history of human food. Fire is so important that cultures around the world have their own fire gods. In ancient Greek mythology, Prometheus stole fire for humankind. In the legends of some Native American tribes, a jaguar's claws striking the ground created the first spark. Even before they mastered fire, primitive humans probably learned from natural events that cooked food was more delicious. After ancient forest fires, people would have found that burnt plants and animals not only tasted better but were also easier to digest. And so, once humans learned to control fire, cooking became our first chemical activity. An ancient Greek gourmand left behind a recipe for baked fish. Sprinkle the catch with herbs, wrap it in fig leaves, and bury it in the embers of a fire to smolder until the leaves are charred, by which time the fish is cooked. A similar method can still be seen in Yunnan and Thai cuisine today, and it bears a striking resemblance to the legendary beggar's chicken. Both use fire directly, without the need for any other tools. Some foods could be eaten after being directly roasted or smoked over a fire. But humans weren't satisfied with this. Having mastered fire, they began to explore cooking utensils. Archaeological finds show that the earliest human cookware was stone. They would heat stones and then place food on them to cook. Later, people invented the cooking pit, a hole dug in the ground and filled with heated stones, forming the most primitive type of oven. If they happened to dig down to the water table, tossing the hot stones into the water led to another cooking method, boiling. As roasting and boiling became established methods, more utensils emerged. Large shells could serve as pots, and certain animal organs could be used as containers. We can still see animal organs used as containers today. For instance, the finest sausages and black puddings must be encased in animal intestines. And then there's the famous Scottish dish, haggis, which uses a sheep's stomach as a container, stuffed with the heart, liver, and lungs, along with blood, before being boiled. Around 10,000 years ago, humans finally created pottery that was both fireproof and waterproof. For the next 10 millennia, people merely improved upon these kitchen utensils. The fundamental methods of cooking did not change. It wasn't until the invention of the microwave that a truly epoch-making revolution occurred. It used electromagnetic waves instead of fire for heating. In 1989, only 20% of French households owned a microwave. By 1995, that figure had jumped to over 50%. The microwave's popularity spread with astonishing speed, but people also found that food cooked in it tasted mediocre. Its greatest benefit was convenience, so it was primarily used for reheating leftovers. To recap the first part, humans mastered fire, which ushered in the era of roasting and smoking. Then came the invention of pits and kilns, leading to baking and boiling. Around 10,000 years ago, the advent of pottery brought pots, pans, and bowls into the kitchen. With that, the first revolution in the history of food was complete. Cooking with fire distinguished civilized people from savages who ate raw flesh and drank blood. With fire, utensils, and cooking methods, humanity took its first steps towards civilization. Next, we move to the second part, the sources of our food. Our food comes mainly from two sources: animal husbandry and agriculture. Let's start with animal husbandry. Its origins lie in the domestication of animals, which marked a major revolution in our food supply. Here, too, we'll begin with a famous dish, French snails or escargots. This was once a humble food, much like crayfish in some cultures. But Parisian restaurants championed this rustic dish, eventually elevating it to become a symbol of French gastronomy. Archaeologists have found snail shells at many prehistoric sites, suggesting that snails and shellfish were likely the first animals to be farmed by humans. They are small, don't require much feed, pose no danger, and reproduce in large numbers. We used to think that the human diet followed a linear progression from gathering to hunting and then to farming. But the author, Fernandez Armesto, argues that for a very long time, these methods coexisted and complemented one another. For example, there was a period in human history that mixed hunting with herding. Both the North American bison and the Northern European reindeer went through such a transitional phase. So, why did humans shift from hunting to herding? After all, wild animals were plentiful, and hunting was both good exercise and exciting. Why go to all the trouble of raising livestock? The answer is simple. People don't do things that don't benefit them. The greatest advantage of shifting from hunting to herding was gaining a stable food supply. The second benefit was the ability to refine and selectively breed animals for meat that better suited human tastes. Take, for instance, the Argentinian gaucho dish of newborn veal, or the shepherd stew of Wyoming, both of which use unweaned calves and their offal as primary ingredients. The popular restaurant chain Little Sheep specializes in hot pots made with young lamb. This is the advantage of animal husbandry. When hunting, you take what you can get and can't always count on finding an unweaned animal. Today, there's a growing fashion for game, but this isn't because freshly hunted meat is particularly delicious. It's mostly because wild game is rarer and more expensive than meat from farmed animals. Animal husbandry had a third benefit. It introduced dairy products into the human diet. But not everyone is well suited to consuming dairy. Only people of European, North American, and some Middle Eastern and Central Asian descent can properly digest animal milk. In other parts of the world, people have little interest in dairy and a limited ability to digest it. Cheese is one of Europe's most important foods, yet in the rich and varied food culture of China, dishes based on dairy are almost non-existent. When Japan first encountered Western civilization, they disliked what they called the stink of milk on Westerners. This revolution from hunting to farming didn't just happen on land, it's also taking place in the oceans. In fact, the 20th century was possibly the greatest era of hunting in human history, because the fish catch during that century was at least 40 times greater than in the previous one. Over the course of the 20th century, we took some 3 billion tons of fish from the seas. This frenzied fishing has led to the complete collapse of many of the world's fisheries. Canada closed its cod fishery in 1996, with Atlantic cod stocks at just 1/10 of their historic average. The California sardine and North Sea herring have also become rare. In the 1930s, Japan had the world's largest sardine fishery, but by 1994, its sardines were nearly extinct. As fish stocks in the sea have dwindled, aquaculture has risen to take their place. This shows that the food source revolution from hunting to farming is still underway today. In 1980, 5 million tons of human food came from fish farming. By the start of the 21st century, this figure had risen to 25 million tons. In the wild, only 1 in a million fish eggs survives to maturity. With artificial insemination, however, around 80% of eggs can be fertilized, and 60% of those will successfully hatch. We can also use hormones to boost fertility, making farmed fish grow faster and larger than their wild counterparts. For example, farmed salmon can yield 300 tons of meat per hectare, 15 times more than beef cattle. Having covered animal husbandry, let's turn to agriculture. Humans first learned to hunt and gather, taking what they could from nature. In the process, they gradually learned to cultivate crops. The author explores the question of how humanity embarked on the agricultural revolution. He concludes that before people began planting crops, they went through a phase of coexistence with plants, slowly mastering knowledge about them. Humans cultivated the land, and cereal crops were their most magnificent achievement. Their grains are rich in starch and protein. 6 of these crops have been the most significant for human civilization: wheat, maize, rice, millet, barley, and rye. They form the foundation of our staple foods. In Christian civilization, bread made from wheat is seen as a holy sacrament. In the Americas, people would set aside a special plot of land near their temples to grow maize. These are expressions of staple food worship, because it was these grains that allowed more people to be fed. Now, let's get to know these 6 crops, which I'll introduce in reverse order of their contribution to humanity. First is rye. Rye's advantage is its ability to grow in cold climates and poor soil. From 1000 BC, it was the main crop in Northern Europe, where fields were often cleared from forests, and the environment was cool and damp. Rye grains are slightly bitter, and the bread made from them has a sour taste. In the past, rye bread was food for the poor. Today, however, as people pursue healthier lifestyles and a return to basics, an increasing number of young professionals are developing a taste for rye products. Barley is even more adaptable than rye. The Tibetan plateau has cultivated barley since the 5th century AD, and to this day, Tibetans enjoy eating tsampa, a dough made from roasted barley flour. Archaeological evidence shows that people living in Syria 13,000 years ago were already gathering wild barley. It isn't well suited for making bread and is usually eaten whole in soups. It was the earliest staple food of ancient Greece, and you can still see barley motifs on the oldest Athenian coins. Millet is another incredibly hardy grain. Unlike rye, which prefers the cold, millet thrives in hot, dry environments. It's rich in oil and has a higher protein content than wheat. While millet has had little impact on Western civilization, this nutritious staple nourished the Chinese civilization of the Yellow River Valley. The ancient Book of Songs contains the line, "The fields are cleared of weeds and thorns, for I will plant broomcorn and millet, which grow dense and in neat rows." As far back as the Shang dynasty, millet sustained what was then the most densely populated region in the world. It wasn't until around the 5th or 6th century BC that soybeans were introduced to the Yellow River Valley, and wheat arrived even later. Next, our fourth crop, rice. Rice provides 20% of the calories and 13% of the protein consumed by people today, and it is the staple food for 2 billion people worldwide. Before the scientific improvement of wheat, rice was the world's most efficient grain crop. Traditional rice varieties could support 5.63 people per hectare, compared to 3.67 for wheat and 5.06 for maize. East and South Asia, where rice is the staple, have historically been among the world's most densely populated and creative regions. Wheat-eating Europe was relatively underdeveloped for much of history, only beginning its ascent in the last 500 years and gradually catching up with China in the 19th century. Archaeological evidence shows that people were cultivating rice along the shores of lakes in the middle and lower Yangtze River region 8,000 years ago. About 5,000 years ago, dry land rice, irrigated by rainfall, began to be grown in the southernmost parts of North China. As China's territory expanded and the cultures of the Yellow and Yangtze River valleys merged, rice gradually became a symbol of prosperity and the primary food of the Chinese people. In the Middle Ages, the general pattern of crop distribution across Eurasia was rice in the east, wheat as the staple in the west, barley in Central Asia, and millet and rye in more challenging environments. Meanwhile, on the American continent, maize was king. Maize is not exceptionally nutritious on its own, but the indigenous peoples of Latin America understood the importance of a balanced diet long ago, and they would eat it in combination with squash and beans. Finally, let's talk about wheat. Wheat is grown on over 600 million acres of the Earth's surface. It can adapt to all sorts of environments and, through continuous improvement, has conquered ever more territory, growing at an ever faster rate. In our daily lives, two products are closely linked to wheat: beer and bread. There is even a theory that humans developed agriculture and grew grain specifically to brew beer. This isn't a joke. Beer, a drink that can induce intoxication and help one forget their troubles, has played a key role throughout human history. But bread is perhaps even more crucial. The author argues that bread helped wheat become a global crop. The gluten content in wheat is far higher than in other cereals. When water is added, it makes the dough soft and elastic, and this viscosity traps the gases produced during fermentation, allowing the bread to rise and become fluffy. In short, the properties of wheat make it the perfect raw material for bread. Baking delicious bread requires great skill, which is why professional bakers appeared early in human history, whereas there was no such thing as a millet porridge master or a popcorn specialist. You could say that bread is the staple food that demands the most culinary skill, though, of course, those who love noodles would certainly disagree. Having introduced the 6 cereal crops vital to humanity, we have to ask, are they enough to feed the whole world? Not quite. We also need root and tuber crops. One of the earliest agricultural techniques mastered by humans was the cultivation of taro. Taro is easy to digest and suitable for all ages, but its drawback is that it doesn't store well. A key characteristic of staple foods in early agricultural societies was durability. Consequently, taro's prominence was gradually superseded by yams, sweet potatoes, and potatoes. The earliest known cultivation of the potato began more than 7,000 years ago in Peru. From there, this miraculous crop flourished in the Andes Mountains. It has two remarkable features. First, it can thrive at high altitudes, and second, it is incredibly nutritious. As long as you eat enough of them, potatoes can supply almost all the nutrients the human body needs. Following the Age of Discovery, Europeans arrived in the Americas and were the first to learn how to grow the crops of this new world. While most of Europe was unsuitable for growing maize, it was perfect for potatoes. Combined with their high nutritional value and calorie content, potatoes became the staple food for people in some parts of Europe. This also created a vulnerability. If the potato crop failed, it would trigger a famine, as was the case with the Great Famine in Ireland in 1845. Interestingly, whenever war broke out in Europe, the cultivation of potatoes would expand. It is truly a crop that benefits the poor. Next, the sweet potato. The sweet potato arrived in China along with maize. The character fan fan in its Chinese name indicates its foreign origin. The earliest records of it appear in 1560. It's a pity that the adoption of these foreign crops in China was rather slow. If maize, potatoes, and sweet potatoes had been widely cultivated during the Ming Dynasty, perhaps the famines and peasant uprisings that followed might never have happened. Today, maize consumption in China has surpassed that of millet, but like the sweet potato, it remains a supplementary food, never managing to usurp the position of rice. As an aside, there's another crop, originally from Brazil, that has spread around the world but remains on the fringes in most places, yet is revered as a delicacy in China: the peanut. The name the Chinese gave it is full of poetry, luhuaxing, meaning born of a fallen flower, much more melodious than baogu, a common name for maize. And that brings us to the end of the second part. We've explored the origins of human food, the transition from gathering and hunting to agriculture and animal husbandry. We once thought the shift from hunting to herding was long complete, but in fact, the amount of fish caught in the 20th century exceeded that of all previous centuries combined. Wild fish stocks are now facing exhaustion, and we will be eating more and more farmed fish. This revolution, therefore, is still in progress. We also looked at the 6 cereal crops that nourished human civilization, as well as the equally indispensable potatoes and sweet potatoes. From their places of origin, they followed in the footsteps of humankind, finding new homes to grow in all over the world. Now we enter the third part, the formation of taste. The taste of civilization is not, after all, a pure history of agriculture. Any discussion of food must inevitably turn to culinary culture. In today's globalized world, we can easily sample cuisines from every corner of the globe, yet most of us are still most comfortable with the tastes of home. This is a memory ingrained in our taste buds from childhood, and it's especially evident at breakfast. People who like cereal eat cereal. People who like a fried egg eat a fried egg. French and Anglo-American tastes diverge, while the complex world of Chinese cuisine considers itself second to none. This all goes to show that food, like language and religion, has a powerful cultural identity. Culinary cultures are often highly conservative. Traditional dishes inevitably combine local staple ingredients and seasonings. These flavors become deeply imprinted on the collective palate, making people indifferent or even resistant to other tastes. However, two forces can break down these culinary barriers: war and colonialism. For example, in Egypt, there is a snack called kushari, made from rice, lentils, onions, and spices, which is very similar to the Indian dish khichdi. We can deduce from this that it was likely brought to Egypt from India by the British Army. Likewise, the British left behind 2 dishes in Pakistan: roast chicken with bread and roast beef with Yorkshire pudding. Furthermore, when Muslims occupied Spain in the Middle Ages, most of the country switched from cooking with pork lard to using olive oil. The formation of taste is also deeply influenced by the migration and fusion of foods. The paths of ingredients like maize, sugarcane, and sweet potatoes around the globe are clear to trace, and the blending and evolution of delicious flavors also follow their own logic, though sometimes it is more hidden. In the United States, there is a cuisine called Tex-Mex, a fusion of Texan and Mexican flavors. A large part of Texas was wrested from Mexico by the United States, but Mexico has reconquered Texas with its iconic food. Standard Mexican ingredients like chilies, maize, and black beans form the foundation of southwestern American cuisine. The official state dish of Texas, chili con carne, is a stew made from minced meat, black beans, chilies, and cumin. The use of cumin was most likely introduced to Mexico by early Spanish colonists. Let's turn our attention to Asia. Almost every Filipino dish is served with white rice seasoned with pepper leaves. The white rice is a hallmark of Chinese culinary influence, while the pepper leaves represent the Philippines' indigenous roots. At the same time, bread is also a staple in Filipino cuisine, often flavored with coconut. Dishes like lechon roast suckling pig and seafood paella, despite having different names, are distinctly Spanish. The Filipino kitchen vocabulary is peppered with Spanish words, and they have a great love for a dessert that originated in Spain and became a global sensation: creme caramel or leche flan. In these dishes, we can clearly see the deep imprints left by Chinese culture, local traditions, and Spanish colonial history. While rice in Southeast Asia is combined with distinctive local spices, in Iran, it was originally a food reserved for the royal court. They imported high-quality rice from India, and its preparation was incredibly complex. First soaked for 2 hours, then boiled until al dente, then mixed with fat and steamed for half an hour, and finally combined with lamb, cherries, saffron, and other spices. The reason for taking such pains over a bowl of rice was that Iran's climate is not suited for growing paddy rice. To be able to eat rice was, in itself, a symbol of power. Now, let's look at Europe. Dutch cuisine has a reputation for being, shall we say, uninspiring. Yet the Netherlands has two so-called national dishes. One is the rijstafel, and the other is hutspot. The rijstafel, or rice table, was invented during the Dutch colonial period in Indonesia. The staple is white rice, served with more than a dozen accompanying dishes. The main sauce is a fried chili paste, and key dishes include Indonesian beef stew, cooked with spices native to Sumatra like ginger and salam leaves. This down-to-earth rice meal, which sounds a bit like a set menu at an overseas Chinese restaurant, is actually served with a great deal of ceremony. All the dishes are presented in brass containers kept warm by spirit lamps underneath. The other dish, hutspot, is simply potatoes, carrots, and onions all boiled together until soft. Modern recipes usually specify the addition of beef or sausage. Historically, this dish is linked to the city of Leiden. In 1574, Leiden was under siege by Spanish invaders. With food scarce, the citizens threw all the root vegetables they could find into a pot to stew. Whether there was any beef or sausage in the pot during the siege is another question. The dish is somewhat similar to the Chinese Emperor's Rescue Stew. These two Dutch national dishes, one commemorating their colonial history in Indonesia, the other their own independence and liberation, are, you could say, steeped in sentiment. And with that, we're coming to the end of our discussion for today. Finally, let's summarize the core ideas of The Taste of Civilization. The author traces our journey to the modern dinner table, starting from the moment humans first learned to use fire. First, fire was the beginning of cooking. For most of history, we cooked with fire, and the evolution of our kitchens and utensils was largely a process of refinement. The first truly fundamental revolution was the microwave, which taught us to cook with electromagnetic waves, even if the results are somewhat underwhelming. Cooking allowed humanity to leave behind raw food, marking the transition from savagery to civilization. Even when we eat raw oysters or sashimi today, such dishes are accompanied by highly refined preparation and table etiquette. Second, the sources of our food have been revolutionized. Through hunting, humans gradually learned to domesticate animals through a coexistence with plants. They began the agricultural revolution. 6 great cereal crops nourished human civilization, and the continued growth of our population also owes a debt to potatoes and sweet potatoes. These crops traveled from their native lands, following human footsteps to find new, fertile ground across the globe. Third, our tastes are shaped by culture. A preference for certain flavors is formed by the main local ingredients and seasonings, and reinforced through repeated exposure until it becomes ingrained, sometimes even leading to a rejection of other tastes. Like language, food has a distinct cultural identity, and the histories of war and colonialism have inadvertently promoted the fusion of cuisines, making our palates richer and more varied. In short, every dish we taste today contains within it the long, evolutionary path of human civilization. Congratulations, you've just finished another book. I wish you bon appetit.